And you're someone who lies awake in bed in Middlesex having weird dreams about immigrants. You're not someone who's had...
You're very rude to me, aren't you?
Well, I am very rude to you, yes, because of what you've done to my country.
What I've done?
And now you're here to tell me you've got no clue about anything.
What have I done? I voted for Brexit. It was 51% against 49%.
You voted for Brexit, and you still cling to the carcass that it could somehow have gone well. And apart from making life difficult for people who don't look like you, you haven't got a single clue what that means, what you want, or how you'd go about getting it. So how on earth, Richard, could I not be rude to you?
There's a reason the British MSM is dying a long, slow death, with woke ITV, Sly News, LBC, and even GB News now on life support. And that's because anytime there's a real story that needs to be uncovered, they run to protect their fellow mates who make up the elite class, the Westminster establishment, and the British deep state. So as you know, I have been covering the real story about the shape of Slippery Starmer's secret family and the truth about his troubled marriage to Lady Victoria for months, with absolutely no follow-ups from the MSM. Now they're doing the same with the Starmer Ukrainian male model firebombers, gutlessly hiding behind contempt of court laws just like they did when it came to Axel Ruder-Cabana. As former MP Simon Danczuk posted, he was a Labour MP by the way, this Starmer story is peculiar. I've co-written 2 true-life books about scandal, politicians, power, etc., researching them in detail, but this is the strangest of tales. What's the motive, the connection? Suspect they'll be pressured to plead guilty, and at that point, our corrupt system means we never hear the truth. It's been left to the likes of Outspoken and George Galloway, us folk in the independent media, to fill the void.
Of the victim of these crimes is. I don't know if Keir Starmer prefers men or women, and I don't care. I don't care whether he's a top or a bottom.
For many months, I was also the only one prepared to talk about the UK Southport massacre social media political prisoners like Lucy Connolly, which the MSM has finally decided is a story 6 months too late. And look, I'm going to be honest about this. Of course I do embrace people coming on board late. So GB News and Matt Goodwin, and I saw today Piers Morgan finally covering the story. But it's like, guys, this has been a story for 6 months, and it's depressing that it takes the Overton window to shift, thanks to the brilliant work that Alison Pearson at the Daily Telegraph did, before you feel comfortable to talk about this. And by the way, I note that today we have learned that Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is now aware of the Lucy Connolly case. Thank you, I believe, to Charlie Quirk for making that happen. But I think the MSM, when you look at these stories, is actually the biggest problems behind our troubles. I mean, have you seen them cover? No. I've seen them totally ignore the story of the new mayor of Rotherham, who has pledged to serve the Muslim citizens of Pakistan rather than her English constituents. Yes, that is a scene from England. But the wheels are starting to come off their bias, so much so that the truly despicable James O'Brien has now resorted to flat out abusing callers live on air on LBC as he sees that his domination of the argument and the narrative is slipping away fast.
What would I have done?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a politician. That's not my expertise.
No, but if you don't have a view on that...
I would certainly have sealed the borders up.
Apart from somehow sealing our borders, when I ask you what you could or what any politician could have done differently, you've got nothing.
I haven't got nothing. I'm not an
then.
expert on how I would seal the borders.
No, but let's forget about sealing the borders and talk about how Brexit could have gone better.
Sealing the borders is not the right words.
Well, I think they were yours. Apart from immigration, how could Brexit have gone better?
Apart from immigration?
Yeah.
By having control of your own country, which I wouldn't know whether we have or not, and not being ruled by Europe.
In what way? Give me an example of that, would you?
I can't give you an example.
Does that not embarrass you?
I am slightly embarrassed because I'm not an expert. I'm
Do you know who else isn't an expert on this?
You.
No, I am. Ask me anything. Every single person who's encouraged you to support Brexit. There's not a single expert among them. And yet you're still trusting them instead of the people who are being proved right about everything. And I hear the chuckle, and that means that you're not someone who's been desperately affected by Brexit. You're not someone whose business has been shut down. You're someone who lies awake in bed in Middlesex having weird dreams about immigrants. You're not someone who's had...
You're very rude to me, aren't you?
Well, I am very rude to you, yes, because of what you've done to my country.
What I've done.
And now you're here to tell me you've got no clue about anything.
What have I done? I voted for Brexit. It was 51% against 49%.
You voted for Brexit, and you still cling to the carcass that it could somehow have gone well. And apart from making life difficult for people who don't look like you haven't got a single clue what that means, what you want, or how you'd go about getting it. So how on earth, Richard, could I not be rude to you?
Well, a lot of people are rude to me because I've got very strong views on certain things.
No, it's not because you've got very strong views, Richard. It's because you can't explain a single one of them.
What an arsehole. What an absolute arsehole. And his abuse of the ordinary people of Britain who can see what is happening to our great country, while the elites like Susanna Reid of the dying Good Morning Britain on Woke ITV, which, by the way, has also slashed its staff and output this week, well, it puts them on the wrong side of history.
Do you feel like a stranger on your island?
Well, I live in the most diverse city in the UK, London.
We're in it now.
And I don't feel like a stranger.
No.
I feel like I'm in a really rich,
Vibrant.
multicultural society.
In London, I live in...
But am I out of touch with people who this phrase is going to chime with? Because I don't really understand.
Yes, you are. You are, Susanna. Trust me, you are. What I find fascinating, though, is that after spending years denying their bias, the ex-staff of organisations like the British Bashing Corporation are now publicly admitting how they spent years trying to manipulate the news while being paid with our money. Listen to this disgusting admission from Jon Sopel on the fake news agents who, remember, led coverage of the first Trump administration for years for our apparently impartial state broadcaster.
You know, I would at times, I know, push the boundaries and want to push the boundaries because, you know, I want to say something interesting. But the way you, my kind of fallback position on social media.
And here we are.
Yeah, I know. I know. But I didn't, you know, I didn't get done over for, well, I got done over for one or two tweets, but was to put a question mark at the end. Is this an act of reckless stupidity by Donald Trump? Question mark. You know, I'm not saying it is. I'm just raising the question. And that was the kind of, you know, that was the way you would sort of editorialise.
Did you ever have to litigate that with somebody? Did somebody ever say you've overstepped the mark and you went, oh no, I was just asking a question? I mean, is it like saying alleged? I mean, does it actually stand up?
Well, it sort of does, as long as you're not saying it definitively, or you're saying, I'm hearing in Washington some people saying ... You've put it into someone else's voice and it's not your own voice.
Well, the game is up because Jon Sopel and Emily Maitlis have just admitted what they've done for years. But by the way, we already knew. That's why the MSM in the United Kingdom is not just on life support, it's already dying. Now, today's superstar panel. But first, the reason you're watching this show is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to trust mainstream media or the so-called fact-checkers who claim to determine which facts are true. And for good reason, given the ongoing debates over free speech, the controversy surrounding Brexit, and how Trump and other anti-establishment politicians are portrayed. But I have the solution for you. It is called Ground News, and it's the best way to stay informed and cut through media bias and manipulative narratives so you can get the facts for yourself. This has been a game changer for a news junkie like me. You can see it for yourself at ground.news/outspoken. But I want to show you this incredible website and app in action. So let's look at the decision recently by the UK Supreme Court that ruled that women can only be biological adult human females, reversing years of trans extremism. You can see clearly in one place that over 350 sources around the world are covering this story. Ground News instantly shows how the story is being covered by the media, broken down by whether it leans left or right, illustrated by its bias distribution chart. If you scroll down, you can see every headline about the story along with the political bias and ownership of the publication. So we can see clearly for ourselves that on the right, the Daily Wire covered the case very accurately with the headline, UK Supreme Court rules trans-identifying men are not women. Spiked Online was even more forthright, declaring women exist, get over it. And the Telegraph looked in depth at the disgraced famous faces who declared trans women are women. By stark contrast, the left-wing National said the result was only a victory for gender-critical feminists, and the Canary ran with the clearly ludicrous headline, victory for the far right, as Supreme Court rolls back trans women's rights by 2 decades. Far right? Try calling J.K. Rowling that to her face. My favourite feature is their blind spot feed, which services upwards of 20 stories daily that receive the majority of coverage from one side of the political spectrum. If you love the news like I do, the blind spot feed is the best way to get a balanced perspective on what's happening. So go to ground.news/outspoken or scan the QR code to subscribe today. Get 40% off the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access. That's ground.news/outspoken. But now, back to the show. Very excited to have this Friday the UK and Europe director of the Heartland Institute, Lois Perry, and all-round property expert, broadcasting genius, Russell Quirk. So, Russell, a lot to go at there. But can we just start by talking about James O'Brien? I mean, is the guy actually having a meltdown? A breakdown?
Yeah, James O'Brien, I mean, what a contemptible little worm that man is. He's always been the wrong side of feisty, shall we say, and a man that I think, I mean, what are we, 9 years on from the Brexit vote, which, of course, I know has been topical this week, of course, in particular because of Keir Starmer basically falling over to give the EU whatever it is that they want by way of this kind of acquiescence, ripping up Brexit and kind of, hugging the EU once more. But so he's never stopped banging on about Brexit, which is one thing. But now he's in a position, it seems, because I guess he believes that he is broadcasting royalty, broadcasting elite from his ivory tower there in Leicester Square. He believes that when someone, has the loyalty to listen to that station, the LBC station, owned by Global, which of course makes its money from advertising, those people that actually are what the advertisers are paying to get to by way of an audience. He's now decided not just to be contemptible and abrasive and a nasty little man, but to royally abuse the people that are calling in to challenge him. I mean, some of the stuff you've already promoted in your VT, but some of the stuff he said, there's one thing in particular that I wrote down, which you might come to, so forgive me if I'm preempting, Dan, but he actually says to Richard, that calls in with an opinion, not only does he expect him to be an expert and a politician to have an answer, a technical answer for everything, and why would he? Richard is just like us. He's just, an ordinary member of the public with a view. But he then says to him towards the end of that exchange, that disgusting, disgraceful exchange over 5 or 6 minutes, he says, why were you stupid enough to call? Now, where's Ofcom when you need them, Dan? Because you and I have been the wrong side of Ofcom. We've all been the wrong side of Ofcom. Ofcom, I think, are, positively Chinese state in their oversight.
This is why the off-communists shouldn't exist. Okay, so I'm a free speech absolutist. The off-communists shouldn't exist. But you do make a very good point, Russell, and Lois, you can come in on this, because the fact is, Russell's completely right, if that broadcast had taken place on GB News, there would have been an investigation, there would have been a finding, there would have been a decision that this was a completely inappropriate way to treat someone and was totally biased and crooked. But when the left-wing media do this stuff, they're completely left alone. So my personal opinion is just everyone should be left alone. But the off-communists, if they are going to exist, they've got to play by a level playing field, don't they?
I mean, I completely agree with you, but I think, as you said about slip sliding away, I think we're seeing the dying gasps of a man who's seen the narrative slip sliding away, quicker than our Prime Minister and one of his very young men. Yeah, I mean, I've been on the wrong side of the of Ofcom before. I've discussed on your programme, Dan, that I was taken off air on a number of occasions and then brought back on again on Talk and GB News because of my stance on net zero. And again, as you said at the beginning of the programme, nut zero, I pinched that. I hope you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
Thank you. But I mean, as you said earlier, when the Overton window shifts, then suddenly it's okay. So everyone's talking about net zero now. Nigel Farage has made it acceptable to talk about net zero. But yeah, I mean, I was taken off air, brought back on air on a number of occasions. I had Ofcom ring Talk TV to say she's our worst nightmare because she's not a staid, boring-looking middle-aged man. No offence to anyone, and she's funny. We need to get her off air. I was actually told that by a friend of mine.
Wow.
So yeah, there you go.
So they targeted
it's okay if you're communicating badly.
They targeted you.
They said, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I was told by a friend of a friend.
That's what we do here, Lois.
That I was that I was considered their worst nightmare with net zero because I was using their words, glamour and humour, to just take the mickey, and that was more threatening than having a scientist come on and talk about CO2.
Of course it is,
or
because
whatever.
people just switch off with that, don't they? And then, Russell, we see contempt of court being used again for the MSM to just completely wash their hands of looking at this Ukrainian male model firebomber story at all. And I think the contempt of court laws in this country are now actually being used to cover up genuine stories that are in the national interest, because we saw it with Axel Rudikabana as well. Russell, we still don't really know the truth about Axel Rudikabana. We don't know the truth about his conversion to Islam. The mainstream media pretend that didn't happen. We don't know the truth about his parents, and it's all hidden behind contempt of court.
Yes, with what we should have enshrined in our culture, we used to have by way of freedom of speech, freedom of congregation and so on. There's also a free press, but as you rightly say, Dan, it's becoming less and less free by the day. And I think the reason is, and people will have all sorts of conspiracy theories as to why. I tell you what it is. It's as simple as this, I think, is that the MSM, apart from being very, very scared of Ofcom, I mean, all of them are very, very worried indeed about a plethora of complaints that is reputationally bad, but also, of course, comes with a fine. And there are certain organisations, of course, that if they were to be fined 5 or 10 times in a year, they probably wouldn't survive that. But the other thing I think is this really selfish approach to journalism, present company accepted, by the way, but in the mainstream media, which is one of access. And that is to say that if you're a producer or a presenter on one of the mainstream media channels, let's take Susanna Reid, let's just tell it how it is. Susanna Reid as an example. Good Morning Britain, diluted now as they are, as you refer to this week, by way of a huge consolidation of that programme by ITV. They know that if they give those politicians that are in government a hard time, those politicians, that government, that front bench, will simply refuse to go onto their programme. And then they have even less of an excuse for a programme. So it's not very ballsy, is it? And it's not very credible or authentic, basically, to give those in power, particularly people like Keir Starmer, Dave Lammy and Angela Rayner and so on, a really easy time in terms of the stories they pick, simply because they just want to make sure that they get the minister on the morning round on a Monday to Thursday.
What's really interesting too, Lois, is with the Lucy Connolly case. And look, don't get me wrong, I'm delighted that people are now paying attention. I'm delighted that people have woken up. I'm delighted that Marco Rubio is now aware of this case at the White House. That's great. But it's interesting. Let me show you this post on X by Lawrence Fox earlier this afternoon, where he writes, "And just in time, Piers Morgan jumps on the bandwagon." And that's because Piers Morgan has now tweeted, "Lucy's Connolly's tweet below was despicable and clearly an incitement to violence of the kind that then happened, but she deleted it within 4 hours and expressed remorse. For her to get a 31-month prison sentence for posting it is a ridiculous overreach by our justice system." Now, the reality is, Lois, this story has been around for months and months and months. I have been covering it right from the start, right from the sentencing.
You've been a star.
Well, it just annoys me. It's like, look, I'm happy that these people are getting on board now, because the most important thing is justice, and the most important thing is that Lucy Connolly isn't locked up for a tweet. Yeah. That shouldn't happen to anyone. And by the way, she's not the only one. There are other political prisoners. I've spoken about Julie Sweeney a lot. We've obviously got the Tommy Robinson case. There's a whole load of others. But it's a bit like, guys, come on. Like, where were you, Piers Morgan, in September, in October, when these political prisoners were going to jail?
I completely agree with you, and I think there is a big thing about being a bit scared, not to put too fine a point on it. And as Russell was talking about, with advertisers and not wanting to upset the politicians because they're making decisions ultimately, but I feel that people have to get braver. They have to get braver, and it is a real shame, a real shame. I mean, but the thing is, look at the advertising situation. I mean, you've got a situation, for example, I know you're not a big fan of GB News, but they, for the numbers that they they should be getting a certain amount of advertising, and they don't, because you've got organisations that target the wrong views.
Yeah, Stop Funding Hate.
Non-woke.
Well, look, I mean, I was there at the start of GB News, of course, and Stop Funding Hate launched its boycott before we had even launched. What my issue with GB News is, Russell, is that rather than stand up at the very start to the off-communists, to these people that were trying to cancel them, they sort of capitulated. They threw a lot of us under the bus, thinking that that was going to feed the beast and have tack to the centre. But I don't think feeding that beast ever works. So I think in some ways they've been their own worst enemy on this stuff.
Well, the danger is that when you start and launch as a disruptor and as an authentic organisation that is actually there to counter the biased, inauthentic, lame mainstream media, this is what GB News set out to be when they started, whenever it was, 3 years ago. To acquiesce, to kind of move back, is really just to become ITV or Sky or the BBC or Channel 4, and I've had this conversation.
You've got to be fair, Russell. Sorry to interrupt, darling, but you've got to be fair. I mean, the amount of scrutiny that non-woke television stations, radio stations are under. If they got pulled off air, then Lois, we wouldn't have anything, would we?
Lois, if they give in, which arguably, I mean, I'm going to do a Jon Sopel here. Are they? Question mark. If they give in, what is there left on the right?
Well,
and
of course. And the thing is, look, I think you've sometimes got to take that risk, Lois, right? Because is GB News ever really going to be pulled off air by the off-communists? Because imagine the outrage at that point. And by the way, if that happened, then great, go online. That's the future anyway.
But they have actually, they've won a court case against Ofcom, don't forget. They appealed against one of their judgments and GB News won.
Yes.
And that should buoy them in terms of resistance.
No, I do agree with you. Can I just say something very, very quickly about Lawrence Fox? Because I'm a little with him at the moment, because we're good friends. I've known him for years, and then somebody took a silly picture of me when I was in Runcorn bending over a table, and Lawrence Fox said, "Vote reform, get this." And it's a bit mean, isn't it? So I'm just wondering why he did that. So I'm gonna have a chat with him about that, because we've always got on extremely well. And I thought, people do silly things when they're having dinner, and I just thought that was a bit mean, actually. Sorry, I just wanted to get that off my chest.
He's very anti-reform and Nigel Farage, isn't he?
I know, but it was my bottom. It was nothing to do with reform and Nigel Farage.
Oh, love it. Love it. Well,
Anyway,
maybe we're going to have to get you two together. We're going to have
chest.
to get you two together and see what's going on. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.